Before we begin, take a moment to slow down. Relax your shoulders. Unclench your jaw. Let your breathing become natural. There is nothing you need to do right now. Nowhere you need to rush. Just listen. The lives that ran out of air. The incredible collapse of the Biosphere 2 experiment when people trapped inside a closed ecosystem began turning on one another. Part 1 of the day humanity sealed itself under glass. There are some experiments that begin like science, and there are others that begin like prophecy. Biosphere 2 began as birth. In the Arizona desert, beneath a glittering lattice of glass and steel, human beings built one of the strangest structures of the 20th century, a sealed artificial world meant to imitate Earth's living systems on a smaller scale. It was designed as a materially closed ecological system, a place with its own rainforest, ocean, desert, marsh, savanna, farm, and human habitat all under one roof. Today, the University of Arizona describes Biosphere 2 as the world's largest earth science experiment and the largest closed ecological system ever created. The ambition behind it was almost absurdly grand. Not just to grow plants under glass, not just to test greenhouse farming, but to ask whether human beings could one day build self-sustaining worlds away from Earth, on the Moon, on Mars, or anywhere else the future might force them to go. Biosphere 2 was Biosphere 2 because Earth itself was understood as Biosphere 1. The original life support system, the one all other worlds would have to imitate if humanity ever hoped to leave home without dying. On September 26, 1991, 8 people were sealed inside. 4 men, 4 women, scientists, engineers, growers, divers, system managers. The first crew entered with enormous symbolism attached to them. They were not just participants in a scientific study, they were being presented, almost consciously, as prototypes for a future species of human people who might learn how to live inside a world built by intention rather than evolution. The first closure mission ran from September 26, 1991 to September 26, 1993. At the beginning, it must have felt exhilarating to step through an airlock and leave ordinary Earth behind. To know that the air you would breathe, the water you would drink, the food you would eat, and the waste you would recycle were all now part of one closed loop. To feel that you were no longer merely living in a habitat, but inside an argument about the future of civilization. And at first, some of that argument worked. The structure held. The ecological systems did not instantly collapse. The crew survived. The farm produced most of what they needed. In fact, later accounts and published results showed that the agricultural system provided roughly 80% of the crew's nutritional needs over the 2 years, with an average intake of about 20 to 100 calories per person per day. That was not abundance, but it was not trivial either. It meant that the farm, under extreme constraints, was astonishingly productive. But survival is not the same thing as success. And long before the public fully understood it, Biosphere 2 had already started going wrong in ways more intimate than equipment failure. There was not enough food for comfort. There was too much labor for 8 people. The ecosystems behaved like ecosystems do, not like obedient exhibits. Opportunistic species such as cockroaches and invasive ants flourished, while other introduced species died off. Morning glories overran parts of the rainforest. Condensation made the desert too wet. Light levels inside the structure were lower than expected, in part because the glass system admitted significantly less sunlight than outside conditions. This matters because Biosphere 2 did not fail in a cinematic way. It failed biologically. One small imbalance fed another. A design compromise fed a metabolic consequence. A living system refused to behave like a machine. And then came the worst surprise of all. The air itself began to change. Within several months, the crew and managers detected a drop in oxygen and a rise in carbon dioxide. The atmosphere had started close to Earth normal, around 20.9% oxygen, but over roughly 16 months it fell to about 14.2%, the equivalent of living at around 15,000 feet of elevation. Crew members developed headaches, fatigue, and symptoms consistent with altitude stress. One participant later recalled that stepping briefly through a doorway into an oxygen-enriched chamber felt like a physiological rebirth. That is the moment the dream changed tone, because a sealed ecosystem can survive bad headlines. It can survive weird bugs, awkward public perception, even a bland diet. But when the air starts disappearing, the experiment becomes existential. What made the oxygen crisis even more unnerving was that nobody understood it immediately. If oxygen was being consumed, then carbon dioxide should rise correspondingly, but part of that CO2 was disappearing into the concrete structure, where it reacted to form carbonates. The eventual explanation, published by geophysicists studying the crisis, was that soils rich in organic matter drove intense microbial respiration, producing carbon dioxide faster than photosynthesis could replace the oxygen, while the concrete absorbed some of the CO2 and masked the full carbon balance. In plain language, the world under glass was breathing wrong. The soils were alive in exactly the way soils are supposed to be alive, but in a sealed system. That became a danger. Microbes consumed oxygen. Plants did not replace it fast enough. The concrete quietly swallowed part of the carbon dioxide, and the whole structure, because it was so extraordinarily airtight, made the imbalance visible instead of letting it leak away. The very engineering triumph that made Biosphere 2 possible also made its metabolic failures impossible to ignore. Eventually, outside oxygen had to be added. That decision became one of the defining humiliations of the project. Biosphere 2 had been sold as a materially closed world. Pumping in oxygen meant the public could now say what critics had been waiting to say from the beginning. It wasn't truly self-sustaining. Britannica notes that officials decided to inject oxygen on at least 2 occasions, and the event became a symbol of the experiment's inability to maintain its own atmosphere. And yet the tragedy of Biosphere 2 is that the oxygen crisis was only half the story. The other half was human. Closed environments do not merely test machinery and ecology. They test loyalties, temperaments, leadership styles, and the ability of small groups to survive prolonged pressure. Later peer-reviewed analysis of Biosphere 2's group dynamics identified exactly those kinds of stresses. Cohesion, conflict, social support, diversity, leadership, and strained relations between crew and mission control. Retrospective accounts from participants and later summaries agree that the crew became deeply polarized during the first mission. By some accounts, the 8 split into 2 hostile factions before the mission was even half over. People who had entered as collaborators became ideological enemies. Arguments about science, mission priorities, management, and the meaning of closure itself bled into personal relationships. Some wanted to preserve the original integrity of the experiment at all costs. Others wanted more flexibility, more conventional science, less quasi-utopian purity. In a closed system, those disagreements do not diffuse. They accumulate. There is nowhere for resentment to go except deeper into the room. Now imagine the emotional physics of that world. You are hungry. You are tired. The stairs feel steeper every week because the oxygen is thinner. You are working constantly to grow food, maintain systems, monitor ecosystems, and keep the whole synthetic planet from tilting further into imbalance. And the people beside you, the only people who can understand what you are living through, are now the people you can barely stand to look at. This is the part that makes Biosphere 2 feel less like a science story and more like a pressure cooker drama disguised as ecology. The system did not only close around the crew physically, it closed around them psychologically. And outside the glass, the world turned increasingly hostile too. The experiment became a media spectacle. Scientists criticized its rigor. Reporters focused on hunger, infighting, and apparent inconsistencies. Some critics dismissed it as pseudoscience or an expensive stunt. At the same time, defenders argued that much of the mockery came from misunderstanding what a giant systems experiment was supposed to be. Later reflections in The Scientist and other retrospectives have argued that the project generated real research value, even if its public image hardened into failure. But inside the habitat, public nuance did not matter much. What mattered was that the food was limited, the air was thinning, the ecosystems were misbehaving, and the team had become a divided society under a roof that no one could leave. That is why the title The Lives That Ran Out of Air works on more than one level. Yes, the oxygen dropped. But so did patience. So did trust. So did the dream that this new little world would somehow produce a cleaner version of humanity than the one outside. By the time the first crew emerged on September 26, 1993, they had completed a full 2 years, and that itself was remarkable. But they came out not as triumphant founders of a new civilization, but as survivors of a grand experiment that had exposed how fragile closed ecological systems really are, and how quickly the human social fabric can fail when pressure, scarcity, and ideology locked themselves in the same room. So part 1 ends with a world still standing under glass but stripped of its innocence. The desert was still outside. The rainforest was still inside. The machinery still hummed. The crew still breathed. But the dream had cracked. Not because the project was meaningless, and not because nothing had been learned, but because the first great sealed world built for humanity had discovered something brutal. It is not enough to trap nature inside a structure. You also trap human nature with it. Part 2, when the closed world turned on itself, most people remember Biosphere 2 as a joke. A giant glass bubble. 8 people starving politely in jumpsuits. A doom science fantasy that became tabloid material. But that version is too clean, because the real ending was messier, angrier, and much more revealing. The first mission had already shown that the ecosystem could not maintain stable oxygen, that food production was harder than expected, and that small group conflict under closure could become severe. But instead of ending there, the project tried again. After the first mission, researchers and engineers made changes, including sealing exposed concrete to reduce the carbon dioxide sink problem. A second closure experiment began on March 6, 1994, intended to run for 10 months. According to later summaries, that second crew achieved full food sufficiency and did not require oxygen injection. That should have been the redemption arc. The second chance. The cleaner experiment. The one that proved the first collapse had at least produced useful corrections. Instead, the project fell apart in a different way. Not ecologically this time. Institutionally. By 1994, Biosphere 2 was no longer just a sealed habitat experiment. It had become a battlefield over money, management, scientific legitimacy, and control. Historical summaries of the second mission describe a severe dispute in management that led to on-site leadership being removed under a restraining order, with federal marshals involved in the takeover process. The conflict escalated into receivership and external control. Think about that image. A project built to simulate a future world in balance. A giant controlled ecosystem meant to prove humanity could manage itself intelligently inside limits. And in the middle of the second mission, the most powerful system failure is not in the biome. It is in the boardroom. That is why Biosphere 2 remains such a powerful metaphor long after the oxygen charts have faded into history. It was supposed to be a miniature Earth. And what does it discover? That the ecological system is difficult. Yes, but the human management system may be even less stable. At one point in April 1994, 2 members of the first group broke in from outside and opened airlocks and emergency exits, claiming they were acting out of concern for the mission and the safety of the people inside. The incident compromised closure and turned the second mission from a fragile scientific reboot into something closer to civil war. Later accounts disagree on motive and interpretation, but not on the basic point. Biosphere 2 had become so politically and emotionally unstable that people outside the structure physically breached it in the middle of the experiment. The sealed world had to defend itself not from Mars, not from microbes, not from cosmic radiation, but from its own creators. And that may be the most devastating lesson of the whole story, because Biosphere 2 was never only about agriculture or atmospheric chemistry. It was an argument about whether humans could build and govern a closed life support system. By the second mission, the answer looked grim. Even after technical fixes improved some ecological performance, the social architecture around the project was breaking apart. The enclosure may have been airtight. The institution was not. The second closure ended early in 1994. After that, the original dream of Biosphere 2 as a self-contained human world experiment was effectively over. Columbia University later managed the site for research, and in 2007 the University of Arizona took it over for science, eventually assuming ownership in 2011. Today it operates not as a sealed utopia experiment, but as a research facility for Earth systems, climate, water, and ecology. That trajectory matters because it rescues Biosphere 2 from the shallowest version of its own legend. It was not worthless. It was not nothing but a stunt, and it was not the triumphant proof its founders once hoped it would be. It was something rare, a failure large enough to become scientifically valuable. Later scientific and historical evaluations argue that Biosphere 2 produced important lessons about closed ecological systems, carbon cycling, group psychology in confined environments, and the immense complexity of trying to manage coupled human-natural systems. A 2021 retrospective in space. Science and technology describe Biosphere 2 as having contributed vital lessons for living with Earth and, potentially, beyond it. That nuance is essential, because calling Biosphere 2 a total failure is satisfying in the lazy way internet hindsight often is. But total failure teaches little. Biosphere 2 taught too much to be dismissed that easily. It taught that ecosystems are not machines. It taught that material closure is brutally difficult. It taught that like soil metabolism, atmospheric chemistry, and structural design can interact in unexpected ways. It taught that closed environments amplify social conflict instead of smoothing it out. It taught that the people running an isolated world need governance systems as robust as the engineering itself. And in a darker sense, it taught something about Earth. Biosphere 2 was supposed to be a model of life off-world. Instead, it ended up becoming an awkward mirror held up to the only biosphere we actually have. The crew inside could not simply open a supermarket when crops underperformed. They could not choose different atmospheric chemistry. They could not negotiate with oxygen decline. They had to live inside feedback loops. In that sense, the experiment exposed a truth larger than itself. Earth is also a closed system, at least in all the ways that matter to life, and humans are much worse at respecting closed systems than we like to imagine. That is why the interpersonal collapse matters so much. People inside Biosphere 2 did not merely argue. They became an accelerated version of human society under scarcity and stress. Different visions of reality formed. Interpretations hardened. Management became contested. Alliances shifted. Trust eroded. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because one of the reasons Biosphere 2 still feels contemporary is that it accidentally rehearsed a pattern we now recognize at planetary scale: ecological strain plus social fragmentation plus institutional conflict. The closed world under glass became a tiny, expensive premonition of a much larger problem. Now imagine being one of the 8 from the first mission. You went in believing you were helping invent a future. You came out after 2 years hungry, thinner, physiologically stressed, politically divided, and marked by much of the outside world. And yet, years later, some of the participants still defend the core seriousness of what they attempted. That tension is part of why the story remains so compelling. The people involved were not simply fools trapped in a bubble. They were participants in one of the boldest systems experiments ever attempted. And bold systems experiments fail in ways ordinary projects never even reach. So was Biosphere 2 an incredible failure? Yes, if the claim was that 8 humans could live for years in a sealed mini-Earth without major atmospheric intervention, without severe social fracture, and with institutional stability intact. By that standard, the project did not deliver what its mythology promised. Oxygen had to be added, food was insufficient for comfort, and the second mission dissolved into management conflict and breach. But was it only a failure? No, because failure on that scale becomes a form of knowledge. Biosphere 2 helped reveal the difficulty of ecological closure, the significance of hidden carbon sinks, the importance of social dynamics in confined missions, and the need to treat biospheric systems as coupled, living, nonlinear networks rather than controllable display cases. Those lessons now matter not just for space habitat fantasies, but for climate science, resilience studies, and Earth system research. That is the final sting in the story. Biosphere 2 set out to prove that humans could build a second world. Instead, it proved how little we understand the first one. A sealed dome in Arizona was supposed to teach us how to leave Earth. Instead, it helped teach us why Earth is so hard to replace, so hard to manage, and so easy to misunderstand. And the people inside learned that lesson in the body, through hunger, through headaches, through political bitterness, through the sensation of climbing stairs and thinning air while surrounded by plants that were supposed to be saving you. If you are telling this story in voiceover, that is where the camera should linger, not on the glass alone, not on the science diagrams, not on the media circus, but on the human faces behind the glass. 8 people sealed into a dream of perfect interdependence. A rainforest breathing beside them. An ocean biome shimmering under artificial sky. Crops growing, insects multiplying, systems straining. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, the realization settling in that the closed world was not becoming a utopia. It was becoming a test of how quickly paradise turns into politics when the oxygen runs low. that it is the real collapse of Biosphere 2. Not just that the air failed, not just that the food ran thin, not just that management imploded, but that in the most ambitious closed ecosystem ever built, the hardest organism to manage turned out to be the same one that always has been, the human being.